The conference room on the 14th floor smelled like burned coffee and someone's anxiety. Maybe mine. I sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, my hands folded in my lap so no one could see them trembling. Outside the window, downtown Columbus stretched gray and flat under a November sky. I'd been looking at that skyline for 31 years, from different windows, different offices, different moments of my life. I never thought I'd be looking at it from this room, trying to figure out if I was about to lose everything my late husband and I had built together. My son was already seated when I arrived. He didn't stand up. That's when I knew this was not going to go the way he'd told me it would. I should tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. My name is Audrey. I'm 67 years old. I taught high school English for 22 years, American literature mostly, the kind that deals with ordinary people doing extraordinary things to survive. I retired when my husband Glenn got sick. We'd been married 40 years. He passed 3 years ago quietly in the bedroom of the house we bought together in 1989, a craftsman bungalow in Clintonville. The kind of house that has a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a history layered into every wall. Glenn and I didn't have a lot of money. What we had was that house, a small investment account we'd built slowly over the decades, and each other. When he died, I had the house and the account, and I had my son Terrence. Terrence is 41. He works in commercial real estate. He has a wife named Dana and 2 kids I adore. And for most of his life, he was the kind of son who called on Sundays and showed up at Thanksgiving with a good bottle of wine and a loud laugh. I loved him without reservation. Then Glenn died, and something shifted. I didn't see it at first. I was too deep in grief to see much of anything. It started small. Terrence mentioning, gently, that the house was a lot for one person. Dana asking in that light voice she uses when she means something heavy, whether I'd thought about what comes next. Then Terrence suggesting I see a financial advisor, one he'd already chosen, one I'd never met, one whose office happened to be 2 floors below where his firm leased space. I went. I shouldn't have, but I went. The advisor's name was Preston. He was about 35, with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything important yet. He walked me through my assets with a yellow legal pad and a lot of nods. The house, he said, was underleveraged. The investment account was conservative to a fault. Had I considered a trust? Had I considered letting someone with more bandwidth manage the account? I didn't know, sitting in that chair, that Terrence had already told Preston what he wanted the outcome of that meeting to be. I found that out later. 6 months after Glenn passed, Terrence sat me down at my own kitchen table, the round oak table Glenn and I bought at an estate sale in 1994, the one with the burn mark near the edge from a candle we forgot to blow out the night we celebrated paying off the mortgage. And he told me he was worried about me. He said the house was too big. He said the stairs were a liability. He said the neighborhood had changed and the property taxes were only going to climb. He said he'd been talking to some people, he didn't say who, and there was a really interesting senior living community in Westerville, 40 minutes away, that had everything I could possibly need. I told him I was fine. He told me I was being stubborn. I told him his father and I had lived in this house for 31 years, raised him in this house, buried a dog in the backyard of this house, and I was not moving to Westerville to live in a place with everything I could possibly need while someone else decided what that was. He left that night a little cold. Dana texted me the next day to say Terrence was just worried, and she hoped I understood. I said I understood perfectly. What I understood was that my son had started to see my home as an asset, not a place I lived, an asset. I need to explain the financial piece because I know it's the part that's hardest to follow from the outside. When Glenn died, Terrence had offered to help me manage things. I was overwhelmed. The paperwork, the accounts, the decisions. I was 64 years old and I just lost my husband and I could barely remember to eat lunch. So I signed a durable power of attorney, which is a document that allows another person to act on your behalf for financial and legal matters. I gave that power to Terrence. At the time, it felt like love. I understand now that a POA in the wrong hands is a key. It opens everything. Terrence didn't forge anything. He didn't steal outright. What he did was quieter than that. He listed my house on the market without my knowledge, using the POA to authorize the listing. He told the agent I was aware and supportive of the decision. He had already arranged a buyer, a developer who wanted to knock down the 3 craftsman bungalows on my block and put up condominiums, and the sale was structured to close quickly. The first I heard about it was when my neighbor Dottie knocked on my door on a Tuesday morning in October. "Audrey," she said, holding up her phone so I could see the Zillow listing. "Is this real?" The listing showed my house, my front porch, my rocking chairs. It said contingent in a green bar across the corner. Contingent. I stood in my doorway for a long time before I could speak. I called Terrence immediately. He didn't answer. I called Dana. She let it ring. I called my daughter-in-law's mother, with whom I had a polite relationship, and she said she wasn't sure she should get involved. I called Terrence's office, and his assistant said he was in meetings all day. I sat at Glenn's table, our table, and I thought about what to do. Here is what I want you to understand about that moment. I was not stupid. I was not confused. I was not a woman who had lost her grip on reality or her finances or her future. I was a 67-year-old woman who had made one mistake, trusting the wrong person with a piece of paper, and was now sitting in her own kitchen trying to figure out how to undo it. The first thing I did was call an attorney. I know some of you are already asking why I didn't do that right away, months earlier when the pressure started. The honest answer is that I didn't want to believe it was necessary. I didn't want to believe that my son was doing something that required me to call a lawyer. There is a specific kind of grief in that, different from losing a spouse, different from losing a parent. It's the grief of losing the version of someone you thought you knew. I called my attorney, a woman named Sylvia who had handled Glenn's estate and who did not, under any circumstances, sugarcoat things. She picked up on the second ring. I told her about the listing. I told her about the listing. I told her about the POA. I told her what I knew about the buyer and the timeline. There was a pause on the line. Then Sylvia said, "Audrey, listen to me carefully. The first thing we're going to do is revoke that POA. Today, right now, before we hang up. I'm going to email you the revocation form. You're going to sign it, scan it back to me, and I'm going to file it before end of business." I asked her if that would stop the sale. She said it would complicate it significantly. The POA being revoked meant Terrence no longer had authority to act on my behalf. The listing could be contested. The buyer's contract, if it had been signed using the POA, was on shaky ground. But, and this was the part that stayed with me, she said it might not be that simple. Real estate transactions have momentum. There were other parties involved now. Things move fast when money is involved and other people have already started planning around a number. She said, "We can fight this, but you need to be prepared for it to get messy." I told her I'd been a high school English teacher for 22 years. I was no stranger to mess. I revoked the POA that afternoon. Terrence called me that evening. He knew, because Sylvia's office had sent notice to all relevant parties as required. I sat in my armchair, Glenn's armchair really, the brown leather one by the window, and I listened to my son's voice on the phone telling me I had made a mistake, that I didn't understand the financial situation, that the developer was offering a fair price and the money from the sale would set me up comfortably in Westerville, that he had been trying to protect me. I let him finish. Then I said, "Terrence, I revokes the power of attorney this afternoon. The listing has been contested. I'm speaking with my attorney about next steps. I'd like you to know that I am not confused, I am not impaired, and I did not authorize this sale. I think you know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "I doubt it." We didn't speak for 3 weeks after that. But here's where the story takes a turn I didn't expect. Sylvia called me 4 days later. She'd been in contact with the listing agent and the buyer's attorney. The revocation of the POA had, as she predicted, created a legal tangle, but the buyer's team was pushing back. They had invested time and resources in the deal. They were not simply going to walk away because the seller had changed her mind. Then Sylvia said something that surprised me. The buyer is willing to honor the sale, she said, if you agree to it voluntarily. They've actually raised the offer. They want this property. I don't want to sell, I said. I know, she said. But I want you to understand what you're potentially walking away from. The number they're offering is significant. She told me the number. It was more than I expected. Considerably more. The developer had apparently acquired the 2 neighboring properties, and mine was the last piece he needed for the full parcel. I sat with that number for a day. I thought about Glenn. I thought about the burn mark on the table. I thought about what it means to stay somewhere, not because you can't imagine leaving, but because you have chosen, actively and repeatedly, to stay. Then I called Sylvia back and told her I wasn't selling. She said, "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." What came next took almost 8 months. Terrence retained his own attorney. There were letters exchanged, filings, a long, expensive conversation about what a durable POA does and doesn't authorize in the state of Ohio. His position was that he had acted in my best interest. My position was that acting in someone's best interest requires, at minimum, telling them what you're doing. During those 8 months, I did not see my son. I saw my grandchildren twice. Dana brought them by on a Sunday afternoon in February, without telling Terrence, which told me something about where she stood. She sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't say very much. But before she left, she squeezed my hand and said, "I'm sorry." I believed her. I also, during those 8 months, got to know my neighbor Dottie considerably better. She's 72, a retired pediatric nurse, sharp as a tack, funny in a dry Ohio way that sneaks up on you. She started coming over on Thursday evenings. We'd watch an old movie or talk or just sit. She brought over a casserole when Sylvia told me Terrence's attorney had filed a motion I didn't fully understand, and I couldn't eat and I didn't want to call anyone. But I also didn't want to be alone. Dottie didn't ask a lot of questions. She just showed up. There's a kind of loyalty in that. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that makes speeches. Just the kind that comes and sits with you. I started leaving her the house in my will sometime around March. Not all of it, but enough. I changed the will to ensure that if I sold the house in the future, on my own terms, a meaningful portion of the proceeds would go to her. And the investment account, the one Preston had called conservative to a fault, I restructured with a different advisor, one Sylvia recommended, and I put Dottie as secondary beneficiary. Terrence didn't know any of this. There was no reason to tell him. It wasn't about punishment. It was about making sure that the people who showed up were the people who mattered. The meeting on the 14th floor happened in November, a year after Dottie knocked on my door with her phone. It was supposed to be a mediation. Terrence and his attorney on one side of the table, Sylvia and me on the other. A mediator sitting at the head like a referee at something that had already gone too long. Terrence walked in looking the way he always looks in professional settings, polished, composed, the kind of man who has decided in advance how the room will see him. He nodded at me, not warmly. The kind of nod you give someone across a conference table when you've already decided what the outcome will be. His attorney opened by saying that Terrence had acted entirely within the scope of the power of attorney as granted, and that any suggestion of impropriety was a misreading of both the document and his intentions. Sylvia had a folder in front of her. She opened it. She put 3 documents on the table. The first was an email from Terrence to Preston, dated 8 months before the listing went up. In it, Terrence outlined a plan to transition Mom out of the Clintonville property before spring and asked Preston to walk her through the numbers in a way that makes her comfortable with the idea. There was a line near the bottom. She doesn't respond well to being told what to do, so it has to feel like her decision. The room was very quiet. The second document was a text exchange between Terrence and the developer's agent, in which Terrence referred to the property as mine to manage, and discussed the commission structure that he, not I, would receive if the sale closed. I hadn't known about the commission. Sylvia had found it. The third document was a letter from a geriatric care physician whom Terrence had contacted 6 months before the listing. He had asked the physician to conduct a cognitive assessment on me discreetly to establish a record that I was showing signs of difficulty managing complex decisions. I looked at that third document for a long time. I thought about my 31 years of lesson plans. About the AP students I'd coached through Faulkner and Fitzgerald, about the department budget I'd managed for 8 years, the curriculum committee I'd chaired, the retirement speech I'd written for my principal that had made half the faculty cry. I thought about Glenn saying, the last week of his life, "You are the most capable person I have ever known, Audrey. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I looked up at my son. He was looking at the table. His attorney said something. Sylvia said something back. The mediator said something about process. I was only half listening. I was thinking about the burn mark on the table, about how Glenn and I had laughed about it for years, how we'd never tried to sand it out because it was ours. It was part of the story of the table. It was proof that we'd been there, that we'd celebrated something worth celebrating, that we'd forgotten to blow out the candle because we were too happy to think about it. I thought about all the things that can't be leveraged, all the things that have no market value, all the things that are worth more than what a developer would pay to knock them down. The mediation ended without resolution that day. Terrence's side needed time to review the new information. That was the polite way of saying that the documents had changed the landscape considerably. 2 weeks later, Terrence's attorney contacted Sylvia. Terrence was withdrawing all claims. He would not contest the revocation of the POA. He would not pursue any further action related to the listing or the sale. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue a civil claim against him. Sylvia said I could probably win if I pursued it. I told her I wasn't sure winning in that particular way was something I wanted on my record. She said she understood. I signed the agreement on a Wednesday morning at her office, and then I drove home and sat on my front porch in November cold, in my coat and my scarf, in one of the 2 rocking chairs, and I looked at my street. The maples had lost most of their leaves. The houses were familiar. The sidewalk had the same crack it had always had in front of number 26, the one I always step over. The light at that hour was thin and pale and completely beautiful in the way that November light sometimes is, when you're in the right frame of mind to see it. I rocked for a while. Dottie came out of her house across the street, saw me, and raised a hand. I raised mine back. She went back inside and came out 5 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee. She crossed the street, handed me one, and sat down in the other chair without being asked. We didn't say very much. At some point she said, "So it's done?" I said, "It's done." She nodded, drank her coffee. After a while she said, "You know, Glenn would have liked this, watching you sit here like this." I thought about that. He would have said something insufferable about how he told me so, I said. Dottie laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere real. I still live in my house. The rocking chairs are still on the porch. The burn mark is still on the table. Glenn's armchair is still by the window. And on Thursday evenings, Dottie still comes over, and we still watch old movies or just sit. Terrence and I are not close the way we once were. I don't know if we'll get there again. I hope we do. I genuinely do. Not because I owe it to him, but because I remember who he was before whatever happened inside him that made him decide his inheritance was more important than his mother's house. People change in grief, sometimes toward each other and sometimes away. I'm still waiting to see which way he goes. What I know is this: I did not lose my house. I did not lose my name. I did not lose my voice. I almost let grief make me small. Not my own grief, but someone else's plan that relied on my grief to work. They counted on me being too sad, too overwhelmed, too trusting to read the fine print. They were almost right. But I sat at Glenn's table and I thought about who I was before anyone needed anything from me. I thought about the woman who stood in front of 30 students every morning for 22 years and said, "Read carefully. Ask questions. Don't let anyone tell you a story without asking who benefits from you believing it." I took my own advice, and I'm still here. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, the way you do when you're sitting in a rocking chair in November and you finally have the space to think clearly again. Terrence didn't become the person who did this overnight. I know that. I've turned it over enough times to understand that what he did grew slowly, out of a combination of things: real estate logic applied to the wrong situation, grief he never properly dealt with, and maybe a long habit of watching me handle everything and deciding that meant I could be managed. None of that excuses it, but I think understanding it matters, because if I only called him a villain, I'd be missing the part where I had a hand in things too. I made it easy. I handed him the key without asking enough questions. That's not self-blame, it's just honesty. Choices have consequences, and not just for the person making them. What I keep coming back to is this: the moment I stopped being passive was the moment everything changed. Not because I became aggressive or angry or adversarial. I didn't. I called Sylvia, I signed the revocation form, I sat at my table and thought clearly about what I actually wanted. That's it. That was the whole shift. It wasn't dramatic. It was just me deciding to pay attention. I taught English for 22 years, and one of the things I told my students every single year was that the most important skill a person can develop is the ability to read carefully and ask who benefits from the story they're being told. I said it so many times it became something of a joke in my classroom. They'd roll their eyes when I said it. Some of them wrote it in their yearbooks. I never thought I'd need to apply it to my own son, but I did. And when I finally did, when I stopped letting grief make me deferential and started actually reading the situation in front of me, I found what was there: the email, the commission, the physician he contacted. None of that was hidden particularly well. I just hadn't been looking. Dottie crossing the street with 2 cups of coffee and sitting down without being asked. That's what integrity looks like in practice. It's not a speech. It's just showing up. And the people who show up are the people who matter, regardless of what a family tree says. I'm not a bitter woman. I want to be clear about that. I hope Terrence finds his way back to something better. I hope the version of him that used to call on Sundays is still in there somewhere. But I also know that hoping for something doesn't mean waiting for it with your doors unlocked and your name on a document you didn't read closely enough. You can love someone and still protect yourself from them. That's not a contradiction. That's just wisdom, the kind that doesn't come cheap and that nobody hands you. You earn it by living long enough and paying close enough attention. I'm still here. The burn mark is still on the table. And I'm still paying attention.